Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Exploring the Future of Green Buildings and Construction. We are extremely pleased you're joining us today and hope this finds you all healthy and safe. I'm Ben Simmons and serve as the head of the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership Secretariat. This is the 8th webinar in our series on sustainability after COVID-19 and is convened in partnership with the German Corporation for International Cooperation, GIZ, and financed by the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety. We would like to sincerely thank these partners for their support. We are very fortunate today to be joined by a distinguished panel of global infrastructure experts who will explore how collaboration among industry and government can help ensure that short-term stimulus packages contribute to the longer-term sustainable transformation of the construction and building sector. During the webinar, of course, please feel free to make comments through the questions box. It's a fantastic opportunity to engage directly with our experts. I should also mention that a full recording of the webinar will be available on our website at ggkp.org. After the webinar, we would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete our short survey. The feedback definitely helps us shape our future webinars. I would also like to mention that our next webinar in the series will take place next week at the same time and will focus on the role of private finance in ensuring a sustainable recovery. We look forward to having you join us then. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Martina Otto, the moderator for today's event. Martina has a long and distinguished career working with the United Nations and currently leads UNEP's work on cities. I encourage you to take a look at her full bio on the platform. Martina, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to today's webinar and hereby turn the virtual podium over to you.
Thank you so much, Ben. Also from me, a very warm welcome to this webinar, and thanks very much to the GGKP team for having brought us together for what I will hope will be a very engaged and inspiring discussion. As introduced, I'm Martina. I'm heading the city's work, and I'm also heading the Secretariat of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, which is housed in UNEP, and I'm very glad to be your moderator for the session today. Maybe a quick word on the Global Alliance, created at Climate COP21 to accelerate the pace and scale of action towards zero emission, efficient and resilient buildings and construction sector. The Global Alliance has been growing to now over 140 members, gathering national and local government, private sector, intergovernmental organizations, and think tanks, as well as key initiatives. And quite a few of our distinguished panelists today are members as well. We're releasing next month a series of regional roadmaps for Africa, Asia, and Latin America that provide both a framework and a process for setting short, medium, and longer-term targets, identify policies and technologies through co-creation with key actors along the value chain. And as part of the COVID-19 response, the Global ABC is calling for green strings attached to the stimulus packages and a green building recovery, renovation wave, not recovery, but renovation wave. This crisis really has brought home, very sadly, a few key messages, and let me just emphasize them quickly. First is existing vulnerabilities have been exacerbated, and at a time when half the world's population is living under some form of lockdown to prevent the spread of the virus, or is just coming out of it, we are reminded of how important our homes are to our well-being. And the inequalities in access to adequate housing have increased vulnerabilities. And at the same time, building crafts activities are amongst the most impacted, as teleworking is not an option, logically, and certain supplies have become hard to obtain as well. So we've seen new construction retrofits at a record down, and while the predictions for 2020 show that there will be a further decline likely. And that comes obviously with huge impacts on jobs in a sector that has a huge share of informal workers as well. Second is that this has been a real wake-up call about the importance of nature for our well-being. And now you may say, well, nature and buildings, but yes, there's a real role for nature-based solutions in buildings, which do not only help bring back nature in cities, but also to harness a number of additional benefits, such as reduced energy demand for cooling, while providing thermal comfort in a context of increasing heat waves. And my third point is a message on the importance of solidarity and cooperation. And that goes really from communities getting organized to a whole of government cooperation. Really important also in the buildings and construction sector, where we often have to deal with, well, split jurisdictions between the national and the local government. As we turn to the post-COVID recovery, there is no doubt that construction, with its 11 to 13% of global GDP and close to 10% of global workforce, will really be included in the stimulus packages. But the point is really how. And given that the sector is responsible today for some 40% of energy-related GHG emissions, and that the building stock is set to double between now and 2050, we need to make sure that we future-proof related investments. And studies coming out of the 2008 financial crisis have shown us that there's huge job creation potential coming out of green renovation of buildings. And it's not only for the existing building stock, it's also for the new build. We're designing for reuse and recycling of building materials after dismantling and help create new and often more local supply chains. So again, something that can make a real added value to the recovery and the job creation that we're looking at. And finally, it's been very clear that if we're not prepared, a crisis hits us harder. And the climate crisis is at our doorsteps. And if we do not harness the potential in this sector, health impacts from buildings that are ill-equipped to shelter us from increasing heat waves and floods, and that do not provide healthy indoor air quality, will take a huge toll, again, affecting those most who are most vulnerable. Thanks for joining. First question, why are COVID-19 stimulus packages important for a green transformation of the construction sector? And we'll dive into the issues that I just briefly touched upon. And I will want to welcome our distinguished panel with Victoria Burrows, Leena Hook, Maxine Jordan, Terry Max, and Marcin Mitchell. And Victoria is the director of Advancing Net Zero, the pioneering World Green Building Council project to ensure that all buildings are net zero carbon by 2050. Trained in architecture and environmental design, and she has a strong background in the sustainable development area. Leena is the Senior Vice President, Sustainability at Skanska Group. Leena has over 20 years of experience implementing sustainability performance in corporations, working with a broad range of industries, including finance, energy, retail, insurance, real estate, hotels, and food. And Maxine, she leads the energy efficiency in buildings and cooling work within the IEA's Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies program. She provides policy support and analysis in programs participating countries, and she also has led the development of those roadmaps that I mentioned at the outset. Terry has joined us as well. Glad to see you as well. He's the Deputy Director of Climate Finance Governance at Global Affairs Canada, and he has over 25 years of experience in international development practice, policy and programming, including private sector development, trade, investment, development finance, and project management. And we have Marcin. She's the Senior Manager of Climate Business and Strategy at the International Finance Corporation. And Marcin has been working in the energy field for 25 years and brings a deep understanding of global energy systems and markets. And in addition to the work on strategy, Marcin also leads the team of industry specialists at the IFC who identify opportunities in both climate businesses, including in the area of green building. And well, with this really distinguished panel, let us dive into the first question. Let me start with Victoria. With the Net Zero campaign of the World Green Building Council, you set out a really ambitious goal, and in your present role, you support green building councils participating in the Advancing Net Zero project. And through this, you get a really good insight in private sector needs around the globe. What is your take on why COVID-19 stimulus packages are important for a green transformation in the construction sector?
Sure, thank you. So yes, thank you for that introduction. We indeed work with green building councils all around the world to effectively redesign and redefine what we mean by green buildings and moving into a more sustainable and more resilient built environment. And that has never been more important than it is right now. In short, our industry needs to build back better, and by that we mean better than it was even operating and functioning before this crisis hit us. And so these economic stimulus packages can really help support that. The reality is that the building and construction sector must take responsibility for the huge amounts of materials and resources and energy and carbon emissions that they're responsible for. And so stimulus packages should help support the transition to clean power, supporting the renovation of existing buildings, and delivering zero carbon infrastructure in buildings, which will really help kickstart a pipeline of jobs and reskilling, which is necessary to help our sector really respond to the significant carbon emissions it's responsible for.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Victoria. I saw a question in the chat. Will a recording of the webinar and the presentations be available to the participants? We will not have presentations as in PowerPoint presentations, so they won't be made available. It is really meant to be a dialogue, but there will be a recording of the whole session. So yes, watch the space. So again, thanks, Victoria, for that introduction. Let me turn to Leena. Skanska is known for its commitment to integrate sustainability into the business model and its pioneering role also with the green bonds. And I think you also presented to the Swedish government a roadmap of how the construction and development industry can become fossil-free by 2045. So that's super interesting to see how the reaction is there and how we can combine these plans with now the stimulus packages. But what is your take on why the stimulus packages are important for this green transformation?
I think this is a really important possibility, as Victoria says, to build back better. We will see a lot of stimulus and a lot of investments going into infrastructure and the built environment. And by that, we really need to have clear direction when it comes to sustainability criteria. And also, we have to be mindful about that the construction industry also need to build the knowledge and also need to drive innovation for greener buildings as well as for green retrofitting. And by actually using the stimulus package to make the whole industry step up and also incentivize those that are having high ambitions and make them able to build the knowledge and make it more scalable. Because there are a lot of great examples. However, we need to see that the market, including the public customers, are choosing from sustainability criteria as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And maybe with this, let us turn to Marcin. The IEA has just released a new report that does look at COVID responses. And today the IEA holds its 5th global conference on energy efficiency online, of course. Huge endeavor the whole day. So thank you very much for making the time to be with us while this is going on. And maybe you could share with us some of the key findings of the new study that really looked at the why and how.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Martina, for already bringing up a very conveniently timed report. So the IEA published the World Energy Outlook special report on a sustainable recovery last week, and it outlines what are the key measures that are going to be that governments could use now to enable a recovery, an economic recovery. But also one that goes in line with long-term climate objectives. And in this study that was done with the IMF to look at the economic evaluation of different measures, looking at job creation, looking at contribution to GDP, they've worked out a sustainable recovery package. And in this package, we see that buildings or efficiency in general and efficiency buildings construction measures really come out tops on a lot of the criteria that we would rate different policy measures on. So I'm sure I don't need to convince our panel of the benefits of efficient buildings, jobs, but really they have attributes that are particularly timely right now. So as we know, construction employs a huge amount of people, so about 10% of the global workforce, and this current crisis has meant that a lot of them are particularly vulnerable. So that's it's an absolute number, a large number of people. It also contributes a lot to GDP, and so measures as part of stimulus packages that could that look at addressing energy efficiency, both in terms of new construction and retrofits, have the advantage that they could save or create a lot of these jobs and actually net increase in jobs from what we have now in these sectors. It could actually boost GDP. And we also have the advantage that these jobs can be distributed geographically, because if governments looked at spending in social housing, healthcare facilities, these sorts of buildings, we actually see that these could be implemented anywhere. So they have this advantage. There's also the advantage that they're ready now. We already know how to do retrofits. Lots of governments have projects in pipelines that maybe have never actually received the funding, but they are actually planned. So this is a really good time to get these shovel-ready projects out. It also wins on the fact that a lot of the jobs that have been lost or that are particularly vulnerable now match quite well in terms of skills with skills that are needed to undertake renovation. So I encourage, I'll share the link to the report, but it really gives us some really good tools to evaluate how to use these benefits of measures in new buildings or retrofits in recovery packages. So we hope that it'll be a very useful piece of work in implementing policies going forward. Just the last thing that I would say also is that, of course, these skills that are going to be needed now to implement these retrofits or new construction, they're also the skills that we need, as Martina and Victoria mentioned, for the future. If we want to meet climate objectives, there needs to be a huge increase in the amount of these measures being done. So now really is a very good time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Maxine. And we first heard private sector sort of call, then went to the analysis and showing us a few policy measures as well. Now let us turn to a country perspective. And I have to say I had the pleasure of participating on World Environment Day, so not long ago, in a webinar that was held by the Urban Economy Forum with a Canada-focused online dialogue that involved the national and the local government representatives. It was pretty amazing snapshot of actions that have been taken at all levels of government. Carrie, what is your take on why COVID-19 stimulus packages are important for this green transformation of the construction sector? We cannot hear you. Maybe you're still on mute.
Okay, there we go. Everyone's done it. Thank you. So, I would point to sort of the three larger musts on the Paris agenda and climate action. And in fact, these were raised in an event I was just at with banking and industry and financial regulators looking at the challenges that they're facing in a similar way of how to do the green transformation of the financial industry. We have to hit carbon neutrality by 2050. And we know, as you've all pointed out, that infrastructure and the construction industry are major contributing greenhouse gas emitters in that front. So major changes needed there. We are having to go towards a transition to green growth. This will require major infrastructure investments, both within existing and new infrastructure. And then there's the concept of just transition. And true carbon neutrality will only be achieved, sustainable carbon neutrality will only be achieved if we integrate the concept of justice for those who've lost jobs from high carbon industries through no fault of their own, and how can we help absorb some of those jobs? And also, how do we address the negative environmental impacts on local populations? So turning that to the construction industry in particular, as we mentioned, if you include its full supply chain, it's got a significant carbon footprint to address. The sector itself, as many have already pointed out, can also position itself as a major driver of cost savings through energy efficiency, increased resiliency, and as a note, there's increasing engagement by the insurance industry in offering green building insurance incentives. So this can be a real win-win for the industry and others. And then the sector, as we've all mentioned, has been a go-to for rapid job growth during recovery from economic downturn. So there's clearly an opportunity to offer governments providing fiscal stimulus packages with a win-win opportunity for job growth and climate mitigation and adaptation results. And this is backed up by the findings of the Oxford University study that we footnote in our DCED paper on green growth through private sector development that we'll come back to. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I think as a comment for the audience, you see already there's a few things that are crystallizing out very clearly. And one is this point of connecting the different agendas. By doing what needs to be done right now in terms of, well, number one, the health, fighting the health crisis, but then also looking at the social and economic crisis that is coming on the back of that, that we need not to miss out on or to forget about the climate impact. This is the next big thing that will hit us with huge health impacts involved as well, and again huge social and economic impacts too. So by turning things around, you really, what Churchill said, never waste a good crisis. It's really what we need to do. So really use that moment of pause that we have seen in our economies, turn things around. And I think the figures do speak very much for themselves. With the huge job creation potential as well. Has been an interesting question that I want to come back to as well from the participants on what it needs in terms of reskilling labor, and I think the informal sector could be addressed as well. And the second point that I wanted to highlight was the issue of justice, inclusiveness that comes up again and again. So much more people-centered advancements that we need to see, both in terms of the policies, but also how we roll out the technologies. But with all this, I would like to also turn to Marcin, now the finance side of things. The IFC, as a first response, increased package of fast-track financing for emergency response. So a lot has been done to help offer trade financing, working capital support, medium-term financing to private companies that are struggling, and so on. And in the Global ABC, we often quote the IFC's number that green buildings present a significant low carbon investment opportunity in emerging markets. And there's an amazing number with 24.7 trillion by 2030. We do see a little bit of a dichotomy between this huge opportunity and what is being picked up. So how can the stimulus packages be driving a change in this? Marcin.
Great, Martina, thank you so much. And so first, I think that the panelists have made a great case for why building green really makes sense in terms of short-term recovery, the job growth, the green growth sustainability. So I think that case is there for governments, and I hope everyone has heard that. I think the next question is how? How do we actually do this, right? And who needs to be brought on board to make this happen? And I think that's where the issue of finance comes in, that's the issue of the private sector comes in, and we need to focus there. So from the government side, I think that in the short term, they need to work along with the stimulus packages with the enabling environment, right? I loved Leena's point about that the private sector needs clear definitions of what it means to build green. What are we talking about here, right? So governments can indicate that through issues of labeling systems where you mark what existing buildings are green and the level of greenness, and then regulations that can help that, and also green building codes. In the emerging markets, sometimes we don't have the capacity to really regulate and enforce, and so other things need to be done in terms of incentives for green buildings, both for new construction and for retrofitting, and that can be tied into the stimulus programs. But that's only half of the equation. The other half of the equation is on the private sector, both on the financial side and on the development side in the construction industry. And right now, we really need to make the business case to both the financing institutions, the banks, the housing finance institutions, as well as the developers, that green building and building green is a good business for them. We do not have a price on carbon across the board, right? That obviously would help make a business case, but even without a price on carbon, IFC is able to invest, literally billions of dollars in greening infrastructure based on the business case. So we need to be able to demonstrate to banks that, the properties are worth more, they sell for more afterwards, that they are more desirable, to contractors that the energy efficiency is something that aids their owners, that the operating costs and the cost of financing are therefore lower. We need to make those points. And between the working with governments on the policy, the enabling side, and having the business case for building green, that's how we're going to actually move the needle. The case is there, but we need to do education. So I'll stop at that.
Okay, thank you so much, Marcin. And I think it's a perfect point to come in for Leena and to Victoria, maybe in response to that. Leena, all the experience also with the green bonds, for example, you've redirected your external funding towards green. So maybe you come in already. Directly.
Yes, thank you, Martina. And I think we are hitting a really important topic here. And thank you, Kerry and Marcin, for bringing that up, the topic of green finance. Because what has happened the past 5 years, it has absolutely exploded, the possibilities within green finance and green funding. And actually, a lot of the investments within green finance are directed to the built environment. And we have such a great opportunity here because there are standards and sustainability certification schemes making it clear what kind of levels of impact you are with your building actually contributing to. And by that, it's also possible to measure the impact and by that tie it to a green financing solution. What Skanska did was 2014, we actually started issuing our first green bond. And we are using green funding and green bonds to fund our own development project. By now, we have actually, by the year end last year, we had more than 80% of our external funding coming from our green bond or other external green investors. We have actually just now hit 100% of our external funding to our own project development coming from green finance. This is a great way to steer a whole industry towards looking out for measurements when it comes to their impact and being able to prove it towards investors. Because the next step is that investors are not just willing to pay up for something stated being green, you have to show your proof points, your facts and figures of energy efficiency, water efficiency, etc. And by that, we are actually into a great path where we are connecting the financial world, and that's quite a heavy language to use, and connecting it to the language of sustainability and the performance of sustainability. And that is crucial.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Leena. Let me go to Victoria.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Martina. And just to pick up there on Leena's point, I think in order for these stimulus packages to be effective and to support a sort of more sustainable and resilient response or recovery from our sector, I think it's super important that they support that responsible investment and development, but we do need, coming back to that accountability point, to ensure they're embedded in reporting on performance and consumption. So tracking how much you're using in terms of energy, carbon, and also those materials. So, those, as Leena mentioned, the importance of having those performance-based metrics within regulation, because as a sector, we know how to deliver low carbon solutions that do not necessarily cost more or require very complex technologies. We're delivering net zero buildings around the world, and we're starting to now build them at scale. So the industry is ready to deliver those. It really needs that finance and regulation to unlock the potential, and they really should have the confidence in the sector to deliver them. And the way to do that is by setting those performance-based metrics. We don't need to be prescriptive to the design community about how to deliver a net zero building because they know. So we just need to set those targets for performance and then help them deliver. So it's a no-brainer that net zero new buildings should be within those stimulus packages to help with everything we've just covered. And then as we come on to the conversation on renovation of existing buildings, it's a whole nother challenge. But certainly for new buildings, it just should be the case from now on. We've proven that we can do it.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Victoria. We just released as the Global ABC a paper on cost benefit of policy measures, and clearly the performance-based building codes came out as the stellar thing to do. And you may say this is not news. Yes, we know it, but if you look at the figures, that 2/3 of countries do not yet have a mandatory building code in place. This takes and mostly those countries where a lot of the new builds will come, it takes a different scale.
We learn a lot from what we're discussing here, and those experiences from some of the other countries that do head straight to performance-based codes.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting what Marcin said as well, in terms of sometimes, well, even if a code is in place, then sometimes the enforcement is not so easy either. And how can we help overcome those challenges with incentives? How can we help also in a sector? And I want to come back to this question of the informality in the sector. In a lot of the developing countries, it's hugely informal. How do we help? What are some of the ideas that are out there? How to change that? Maybe if we can weave in some of the reskilling as well. I have not forgotten about the question from the audience. Who would like to have a go?
I can start on this. I mean, what we've found, we've just recently put out a paper about policies and incentives that governments can do beyond just the green building codes in order to help get construction to be green. And some of them, of course, can be financial, right? You can give tax incentives and things like that. But you can also give non-financial incentives to developers, such as density, such as being able to build additional floor, such as making the process of permitting easier for those who are going to build green. There are a lot of different ways in which you can incentivize both financially and non-financially developers to build green. So we need to, so please check that out on our website on edgebuildings.com in order to see the different options for policymakers to do that. And again, back to the point also of education, we're working not only with folks who are currently in the construction business, but very surprised at the lack of education of how to build green. And this comes back to Leena's point. In universities and with architects and engineers and the building construction business in general. And so IFC, we have an easy to use building design software called Edge, which is targeted to help construction companies and developers and designers to build green, to understand what techniques and technologies we can use, what materials we can use. I think, Martina, you wrote that issue about what materials we can use. And then finally, one of the comments was that there was a feeling like, well, construction is only going to get us so far. And actually, construction can get us pretty far in terms of energy efficiency. Again, in our program, we're looking at least 40% energy efficiency at the building site before you even move forward to do zero net carbon, which is including renewable energy and offsets and things like that. But we can easily get 40% energy efficiency just by how you build your building and the appliances and the technologies you put in your building. So let's not feel that we can't do that at reasonable costs, reasonable returns.
I can just add on to that with an example from from our industry. We have developed a concept we call it powerhouse. It has actually been called by the World Economic Forum amongst the most in the front line when it comes to net zero buildings. And what it actually does is that it produces more energy than what it is needed through its lifespan, and that is included the energy needed for the materials, transport, operations, etc. And we have put this building in a challenging area, being in the Nordics, in Norway. We have built 4 so far, and one of them is actually not a new build, it is a retrofit. And we are able to do this thanks to solar panels and geothermal technology. But what we actually have done here is actually proven a point, even in a challenging area as not the so sunny Norway, at least not in wintertime, you're able actually to drive technology advancement, where we can see the possibilities with new technologies for green buildings. But we also, I have to admit, a crucial point here, we did this in cooperation with an NGO called Zero, with an architectural firm, but also with Entra, which is a real estate company owned by the state in Norway. So this is also a way for policymakers, but foremost public procurement to be used for the transition that we want to see. Now we have the knowledge of how to do this building. For every time we do one of those kinds of concept buildings, we learn a little bit more, which takes us further on this journey. And that kind of knowledge and knowledge sharing, we have to keep it up, and we have to have incentives for corporations to take on those steps. And not just fight for the lowest cost in production, but actually for the best long-term impact, as well maybe a low cost in the long term due to energy cost savings, etc., as well as a higher premier second value and a more long-term value of the buildings. So yet again, connecting those aspects when it comes to finance and long-term sustainability impact, I find so important.
Thank you so much, Leena. Carrie wanted to come in on a point triggered by Marcin, and I think you picked up on the incentives as well. I think that was his keyword.
Thanks. I just wanted to speak to two of the human elements on different sides of the discussion here. Absolutely agree that incentives are crucial, capacity building for those building codes, et cetera, are crucial, but we have to accept the reality that enforcement goes hand in hand here in many countries. So we've got to allow for governments, in the face of scarcity, in the face of real challenges for their finances, to adequately fund the enforcement capacity, at least in the short term, while the business case is really flowing through. This is especially true in some of the lower income countries out there. The other side I wanted to highlight is it's true that there may be, even at 40%, some limitations on how far we can get on the climate action, but we're not really taking into account the resiliency and the human benefits as well. And I'm thinking to a conversation I had with some women who were dealing with local workers in urban slums in India, who were speaking about just how brutally difficult it is to get their work done, given the heat, given the lack of water, given the lack of infrastructure. One of the benefits of all of these upgrades is that it will make people more resilient, more capable of doing their jobs, being productive, whether it's productive in a job or productive as a parent, contributing to sort of the reproductive roles. So those are other sort of non-financial benefits that we have to account for, and that do have, you know, a bearing here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Carrie. I wanted to move on to the next question, which is really about the balance between the building new and improving the old. And we touched upon the differences, and that both actually have to be part of the stimulus packages and can be part of them. And we want to maybe tease out a little more, but Marcin, I think in the study there's already a number of really good points, a good hint to set us off on that, but I have noted that you wanted to come in on the previous topic as well, so I don't want to cut you off, but you have the floor for both.
Thank you, Martina. It's perfect. I think the two subjects go very well together. I just wanted to continue on from Carrie's point about the multiple benefits of green buildings, of energy efficient buildings. It seems as though in these evaluation of measures, looking at them as being, you know, how appropriate are they to stimulus packages, a lot of the benefits of buildings measures are coming out, and so it seems like a great time to look at all of the multiple benefits that green building does, that we've been trying to argue for so long, about the productivity gains, the asset value gains, the reduced bills for consumers. I think all of these sort of benefits are coming out a bit to the forefront now, which I think is really encouraging. On the point about how to balance between old and new buildings, I think here we have to remember that in the short term, governments are really looking at the health crisis and the economic crisis in households and businesses, and therefore I think the choice of whether to focus on new or existing buildings will not be driven by climate change, by CO2. I think these, we've seen examples of programs, for example, installing rooftop PV, not because it was necessarily the cheapest measure to implement, but it actually had the most relevant, had some great benefits in terms of jobs, and also climate change, of course. So with that in mind, I think governments are going to be looking at what are their priorities, what priorities did they have before, were there programs for schools refurbishment or healthcare refurbishment that are things that were needed, but were not able to be funded at that time. So I think we hope to see investment in these types of areas, and that would be a way of spending, of government spending in the construction industry to meet other benefits. So there's a lot of potential there. And just another point on the financing, what was discussed in a few minutes ago. In the sustainable recovery package that was put together in this report, we see that to really get the benefit of jobs, economic development, and reducing putting structural emissions really on a downward trend, that would need a globally investment of about $1 trillion per year for the next 3 years. And of that, 30% would be of direct government spending. So that means that finance measures to leverage private investment is, of course, going to be really essential. So I just wanted to just another highlight of that point.
Thank you so much, Maxine. I think it's interesting to look at this question, and actually the balancing should not be it's one against the other. We clearly said we needed both, the refurbishment of existing buildings and then doing good on the new ones. I think you're absolutely right in putting your finger on the fact that we have a changed perception to some degree because we've been hit so hard, and we have seen that the vulnerabilities of people who are living in non-adequate places were just so much higher. And I think it's not something we didn't know, but it has just given an additional argument, and it's just as much an additional argument as you mentioned right now with the schools or the hospitals that were up for refurbishment, but it wasn't done. And it's exactly that. I think the sector will be profoundly changed as well in terms of needs that we will see shift, and I'd like you to maybe come in on that point as well. For the new build, I wanted to maybe see whether we can tease out a little more the opportunities for these new value chains as well, where we connect sectors that were not connected, be it agricultural waste products as new materials, be it, things like that, where we can then have a new economic impetus by creating a different chain. And that goes similarly for recycled materials, where we have a lot of stumbling blocks still at the moment. It's more at a demonstration scale. It's done, we know how to do it, but it's not widely picked up. I've seen that Marcin wants to come in, and I give you the floor first.
Okay, great. So first I wanted to address the issue of new building and retrofit. And as you said, Martina, we absolutely need to do both, but we have to think about it also geographically, right? So there's some areas of the world where it's very built already, and so focusing, such as in Europe or the US or even Latin America, so focusing on retrofits makes a lot of sense. There are other parts of the world where you talked about we're going to double our building stock in the next 30 years, where they're building incredible amounts. And obviously building, back better, building right in the first place is the most efficient way of getting these wins in terms of carbon emissions. And so in places like Asia, which is building tremendous amounts, cities, at a time, or Africa, which is the fastest urbanizing area. So, not a lot of infrastructure, but building quickly because people are moving into urban areas. In those places, we really need to think about making sure that we're building it right in the first place. So I would just as we're looking at this, I would just ask that we, have some nuance on that in terms of prioritization. And then I think on the second point, in terms of building materials, this is, a really someplace where we need to go. People don't necessarily think about the whole construction piece and the supply chain. And obviously, our building materials are part of the hardest to decarbonize areas. So we're talking about cement and glass and steel. These are heavy carbon using, producing industries. They're hard to decarbonize. You cannot electrify that. And so we really need technology, research, and huge incentives for these industries to turn them from brown to green, because obviously we're never going to quite get the end use building materials if we do not get better, basic glass and steel and cement to be more carbon, lower carbon emissions. Recycling is really important, and it's absolutely something we can explore today, but the longer term, we really must think about how do we decarbonize these heavy building material sectors.
Okay, thanks very much, Marcin. And there was a comment in the chat earlier that did speak about not only the materials, but also what happens in the transporting and then the construction equipment as well. How do we deal with them? How can we include those in the recovery packages as well? So if that triggers something with someone, I see a few nodding faces. So maybe you want to pick that up. Carrie had requested the floor, so if you'd like to come in.
Right. Can you hear me? I'm having internet challenges. I'm assuming you can hear me.
We can't see you anymore, but we hear you.
Okay, great. Hopefully that'll resolve itself in a moment. I just wanted to add another driver here. Obviously, market demand will drive to what extent there'll be new versus old. But let's bear in mind and let's take advantage of the insurance industry that has just been hammered by increasing levels and volumes of claims for climate-related hits on the infrastructure. And they're developing increasingly incentive packages that could drive a lot of refurbishing, a lot of upgrading of existing infrastructure in a way that allows both the client to have a premium discount and the insurance company to know that they're going to have lower claims over time. So I just wanted to add that.
Excellent, thank you. And indeed, there's a bit of a demand driver that comes from that side. There was a question in the chat as well. How can you make sure that these new offers are being picked up on, and that really goes to the consumers? We touched upon it a little bit. If it's a public it's public buildings, then through public procurement, there's a way of setting the example. But what do we do with the typical building owners, and obviously with the difference whether this is private or whether this is for business, and the certification has come in quite nicely already for whatever is businesses. It comes with corporate social environmental and social responsibility. But for the individual building owners, there's still a bit of a way to go. So maybe if you wanna come in on those points as well. I noted that Leena wanted to come in on Marcin's point on the decarbonization of some of these heavy emitting materials as well.
Yes, I think, Marcin, you're touching such an important point here regarding the need for actually look into the materials and how can we have less of a carbon footprint when it comes to materials. Already today, there are technologies for how we can reduce the carbon footprint and emissions from concrete with 50%, actually with just changing the mixtures. You can also actually start looking at the design and the form of buildings or the infrastructure is also heavily dependent upon what kind of materials you need. We have an example in Boston where we built a building with a rounded shape. And of course, that's kind of a bold design. But the coolness of it, from my point of view, is that it actually needed 10% less cladding, as well as 15% less energy than compared to a normal fit building, due to actually having less direct sun exposure. Those kinds of new ways of thinking with design and how we from the absolute beginning set out to minimize the footprint when it comes to carbon, but also take into account other important environmental issues like biodiversity and like water scarcity, or for that way, today here in Northern Europe, we have quite a heat wave. There are a lot of environmental aspects where the built environment can be a part of the solution, but we have to start to perceive it like that and not just to get stuck on looking at the building or the project as such. We have to see what is it for in a larger context. How do we build a prosperous society around the building where people and environment are doing great?
Excellent. Thank you. Maxine, if you would like to come in on this as well. I think you had a point about extending building lifetimes as well. It's something that in the International Resource Panel report that was released at the COP, the last COP, came out very, very strongly. There's a number of consumption-related issues that we can address as well. So Maxine, please.
Thanks, Martina. Yeah, just wanted to add to the conversation about material efficiency and decarbonizing these sectors that are very difficult to decarbonize. That actually increasing building lifetimes can have a huge impact as well. We have the IEA has a material efficiency report looking at the different types of technologies and scenarios to reduce the CO2 intensity and the overall CO2 emissions from the manufacture of steel, cement and aluminium. And we see that, for example, for cement, about half of the savings actually come from increasing the lifetime of those assets. And I think that's a good thing to remember as we talk about retrofits. Retrofits also have that purpose to increase lifetime of buildings, undertake refurbishments and repurpose buildings, and these also serve as lessons in the design of new buildings so that they can last longer. So I just wanted to add that point, and I'm sure Victoria will have some great insights about materials as well.
Exactly. I just wanted to turn to Victoria because obviously World Green Building Council has done such an amazing report on the embodied carbon. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you were just touching on it there, Maxine. I think one of the things that we say in our report, which is called Bringing Embodied Carbon Up Front, is that the principles of application for reducing embodied carbon have to start with using less. And so if you can maximize the renovation of existing buildings, that not only reduces the amount of materials you need to use, but also helps to improve the performance of existing buildings. And so we really advocate within that report and with our manifesto for climate action that a whole life approach should be taken, that you should be considering the full life cycle of a building, which is tricky to do depending on where you sit along the value chain. But again, it's really about taking that responsibility. And I think, you know, we're starting to see some of the potential from energy renovation of existing buildings in terms of jobs. I think it's something like for every €1 million invested, it's an average of 18 jobs that are created in the UK just on energy renovation in buildings alone. And so there's huge potential from that market that will help with the supply challenge, but also with fuel poverty and the other benefits of improving the performance of existing buildings. I think it's known as one of the most cost-effective solutions to tackle both the economic and the climate crisis in energy efficient renovation strategies. And so it really must be embedded into these stimulation packages. And then when you do need to build new, you look at how to build in the leanest possible way, as Leena was just giving examples, and then the options for you in terms of low carbon alternatives for materials. And I really think that again, different ends of the supply and value chain can help create those signals to create investor confidence, policymaker confidence, set those roadmaps that says this is the trajectory the sector is on, and everybody should be embedding it into the work they're doing.
Thanks very much, Victoria. Very nice overview of the different measures that are out there, the things that we need to think about in getting at this materials issue. And there is obviously a number of stumbling blocks that we have seen. Technology options are there, but then from there to pick up is one thing, but it's also if we talk about existing buildings and we want to take out materials, I mean recycled materials from there, we first need to know where we have what kind of material stocked in a sense. So the material banks sort of question, how do we get that sorted out? But then for the reuse of some of these materials, it's super difficult because regulation is at times preventing. So there's a few things. How can we overcome that, and how can the stimulus packages, to come back to this, help actually drive this process that has been set in motion a little bit? There is much more attention on embodied carbon than there was ever before, but we're far from where we need to be. Leena, do you have any insights?
Yeah,
what is needed?
I can see, coming from the industry, and we are having high ambitions also when it comes to circularity, but it is quite challenging due to a lot of regulation. Of course, there are always uncertainties when you're working with trying to reuse materials, but there are also regulations that are hindering the industry to advancement. And that actually means that at times we have to put in quite a lot of resources for the administration part of it. And that of course is kind of costly. So when we are wishing for a more circular use of materials, we must make sure that the regulation is actually making that happen, so you don't get into a standstill and in the end have to actually do a lot of transportation away to landfill. So there are better ways at looking for also the policymakers to help the circular shift as well to happen when it comes to materials.
Yeah.
And if I dare to take one example as well, we are building the European Spallation Source. It's a huge scientific site being built in the south of Sweden. And what was so impressive was that when the EU set out to choose the construction firm for this, they actually put a lot of pressure on the sustainability criteria. So we did this amazing high ambition. And actually, I do think, of course, a lot of other stuff too, but I do think that was also something that really played a part for us getting the project. Part of that project, such a massive research facility, will have 3,000 researchers, have high levels of biodiversity, energy efficiency, but also during construction, we have a zero waste target. And that means that everything that goes, and nothing should go to waste, everything should go into circular solutions being reused. That means that we need to plan everything we get into that site. We need to have a mean and a plan for it to the bitter end, so to speak. In that way, public procurement is actually pushing for new solution, and for the industry, just like us, to actually develop new standards of how to make this happen.
If I could just add to that, Martina, I think what Leena's really nicely outlined with a real life example there is the need for collaboration across our sector more than ever before. If everybody is working towards that same goal, then it will really help. You know, that's the most important lever for change to help drive that market transformation. If everybody's working towards an ambitious target, no matter what that target might be, then the solutions will fall into place. And I think we're seeing that more and more across the sector. So I think the policymakers can really take confidence that by setting those standards, the industry can deliver them.
Excellent, thank you. I see Karen nodding quite a bit here, and since we heard a few times, well, the government side coming in here, maybe Carrie, a reaction from your side.
You know what? I'll hold off on this one. I think the opportunity on the next question will be ideal for addressing that, if that's okay.
Okay, perfect. I'm looking around. Did anybody want to come in on this point, or should we move to the next question, which indeed is about how can industry and government work together to improve sustainability along construction supply chain? So, Terry.
Great. Well, thank you. And you know, it's really exciting hearing this conversation, given, of course, that governments and industry, as we all know, have a shared challenge here, right? How to use scarce resources to get the most out of COVID recovery policies and programs in a way that has the biggest impact on the short and long-term priorities, whether that's profit maximization for the industry, or whether it's the overall social development, economic gains for government. And part of the thrill here is that there's a great parallel between the paper that I'd just like to briefly introduce from the Donor Committee on Enterprise Development, the Green Growth Working Group, looking at how small and medium enterprises through private sector development can play a really significant role in this process, and how promoting green growth through private sector development in the context of COVID-19 is a really effective way of doing this. And of course, you know, when you're looking at the construction supply chain, you are looking at to a very large extent, a huge number of small and medium enterprises. So there are a number of the principles that we highlight in the paper that apply equally and have been outlined in this discussion. It's good economics. You know, the studies from Oxford and elsewhere that are demonstrating that green stimulus packages from 2008 onwards have created more jobs, have produced higher short-term returns, and increased longer-term cost savings relative to traditional stimulus measures. And I think the other panelists have described how this would play out in the construction industry and with infrastructure. The double dividend, right? Rapid recovery of economies and faster achievement of, in this case, both the Paris Agreement objectives and the Sustainable Development Goals. Enhancing the resilience of economies and people to future crises. And, you know, as one of you just pointed out, climate change hasn't ground to a halt while we've been dealing with COVID. There are ongoing climate shocks, and these are the biggest significant systemic risk that the construction industry and infrastructure have to face, and that, of course, humanity has to face. But likewise, and we've talked about how this is already happening in the construction industry, it advances a transformative agenda that was already underway. And whether you look at the greening, the financial system, or whether you look at how individual businesses are responding increasingly across the world, people are heading naturally towards this green transition. And that links, of course, to the fact that it's demand driven by the private sector, by global value chains, and, you know, I pointed out the insurance industry and their incentives. So coming to the areas for, you know, industrial and government collaboration, again, there's a great parallel between how we would engage with SMEs. We've addressed the need to have a better understanding of the sustainability dimension of both the business plans and models of industry and the government's COVID-19 recovery packages. So there's an opportunity to engage with private sector and with businesses and support associations in the short and medium term to plan a green economic recovery, to identify opportunities, but also to get the input from them that would allow governments to perhaps rapidly alter some of the regulations and requirements that perhaps require altering more quickly to help facilitate this. And that's all with the view of trying to target sustainable investments. You know, working with investors, working with domestic investment promotion agencies, government departments to create those incentives. Last 3 points are the whole issue of risk management and resilient capacities of the private sector. This is true whether you're talking central banks or insurance industries. All private sector organizations right now are really struggling to come to grips with how to integrate these climate risks. And this is a great opportunity in a COVID response to do that. Finally, we've already addressed the circular economy, which is one of our recommendations, but returning to that just transition concept and the equity objectives to maximize efficiency. We know diversity is good for business. there may be real opportunities here to marry the COVID response with the construction response, with pushing the envelope towards better integration of, let's say, women-led small and medium enterprises. So that would represent a triple win, because as we know, women have been hardest hit in general by the COVID lockdowns, by the economic repercussions, and of course by the responsibilities that they're primarily having to bear in the households under these circumstances. So focusing here on a recovery approach that would tap into construction, tap into women-led enterprises, could help redress these COVID impacts. Thanks. I'm sorry for droning on.
No, excellent. Thanks very much. Well done, Gary. The paper that you highlighted is indeed very interesting and was presented as a background reading, so everybody's encouraged to have a look at it if not yet done so. Marcin, you're working very much at that interface as well. Maybe you'd like to comment on this.
Yeah, I guess the point I want to make is for us to recognize, while it makes a lot of sense, everything that we're saying, how hard it is to actually implement, right? That we need to really recognize where the construction and building industry is and their viewpoint. It is a very tight business. It has low margins, and anything that seems to them going to add costs, that's going to slow down construction, anything along those lines, they are strongly resistant to. And so until we acknowledge that and understand that, and this is particularly with the small businesses, right? There are thin margins for them, and they are very, very concerned. So I would say that one, for governments, as they try to implement, with this stimulus package, that it's important that they, the biggest thing they could do is to help us price some carbon, right, which would really make the business case even stronger, give people incentives. They absolutely need a clear definition of what they want these businesses to do. It's not very clear. We talk about green and in very general terms, but we really need to break it down specifically and to really help these businesses do that. While I work internationally, and my experience in green buildings is also internationally, at home, I sit on the board of a local green, and our purpose is to, provide financing, lower cost financing for businesses who will put in energy efficiency. And it's not, you would think, well, people would just be flocking to our doors, but it's not that easy. And the reason is that, again, the businesses have to see the business case. They have to see what's in it for them. So I think that the creation of jobs and what's in it for government and what's in it for us as a world is really important. But I would emphasize that we educate the businesses, that we're very sensitive to their business models, that we prove the costs. People think that it costs 30% more to build green, and that's not the case. We have to get those messages correct to people, so that we're actually starting to see the changes on the ground. I'll stop there.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much for those additional points. Very well taken. I have Victoria, then Leena, and then Marcin.
Thank you, Martina. I wonder if I could just add to Marcin's comment there. I think increasingly and really promisingly, we're seeing across some of our partners and across our network, more of a conversation around the value proposition for green buildings and net zero buildings, rather than just based on business case. Of course, the return on investment is really important, but actually the risk of inactivity is even worse. And I think we mentioned right at the beginning that people's considerations on what they value is important in their homes, in their offices now will have taken a drastic shift post COVID-19. As we emerge and go back to work, we will completely shift in terms of our working habits, in terms of what we look for when we're buying a property or renting a property, in where we choose to base ourselves. And so I think taking that broader perspective that says, as more and more businesses and organizations take up some of these initiatives, of course, the return on investment will be stronger, the business case will be stronger. But for now, it's not just about dollars and cents. And I think it's really promising that we're seeing some of that narrative coming through as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Leena.
Yes, I'm just building on to what Marcin was stating here regarding that there are a lot, it's quite a scattered industry with a lot of small and local entrepreneurs and firms. And that's great when it comes regarding creating local job opportunities. But it's also a challenge when it comes to knowledge sharing and also taking on new practices due to the low margins within this industry. And that's why it's so important to actually crack the business case and get also the investment incentives in the right direction, as well as for business to know that this is not a thought for this day or this week from politicians. It's actually that is more long term. And in that way, the Paris Agreement, but also the EU stand when it comes to the EU taxonomy, starting to define what is sustainability. So EU is setting out this taxonomy on sustainable finance, and by that actually hitting the absolute core of all industry, but by exactly stating for which industry what kind of levels of impact and performance that will be regarded as sustainable and green, and setting out quite directly when it comes to on climate within our industry, stating a 20% energy efficiency above local norms to be actually regarded as green. So in that way, it takes away a lot of the blur, a lot of the uncertainty within the industry. And Skanska being a large corporation and listed at Nasdaq, we have more than not at a daily basis, but I've had quite some calls and meetings with investors regarding how we are already adapting, how they are adapting to the EU taxonomy, and by that they want to know all the corporations they invest in, how are they actually living up to this? So it has not even started it has not even started to be part of the EU directives yet. However, investors are already aligning to it, and by that having the dialogues with us, corporations, making us align to it. So these kind of clear directions from different markets, that I think that is really important in order to make industry actually make the shift, because we need to have more people understand that this is a direction to go towards.
Excellent, thank you so much. There has been a question as well in the chat about connection between buildings and decentralized energy and energy storage. And I just wanted to bring that in because I thought the word about the value proposition. So this whole transformation, so it's not only a buildings transformation, but it's a much broader transformation that we want to see. And at the moment that everybody is talking about not necessarily wanting to go back to public transport, which obviously is the wrong thing for all kinds of other arguments, but due to the physical distancing, people then returning again to the individual car, which obviously is not what we in FINE would like to see from a climate perspective. But then the whole shift to e-mobility, which then will require a whole different setup in terms of the energy infrastructure. How can we combine those things? And that's yet a bigger ball game, bringing in even more players into what is already a very fragmented field, which makes it difficult as everybody needs to move. And I think everybody gets that message very strongly. Everybody needs to move at the same time in the same direction, which makes it so hard in the sector. But so there's a few additional players. Marcin, I think you also wanted to come in on a few additional players.
Yeah, thank you, Martina. What I wanted to raise builds on what has already been mentioned, but also what you just said about talking about e-mobility and energy storage. I think all of this shows the importance of the narrative and how to sort of win people over. You know, one of the main challenges of energy efficiency, and particularly energy efficiency in construction, given the wide supply chain and the fragmented industry, is that it really cuts across many jurisdictions, but also many different disciplines, and therefore the motivation behind implementing green green building measures might be different depending on what the overall narrative that will be most effective might be. So, for example, it might be air pollution in some places. In other places, it might be e-mobility. And therefore, I think the importance of getting these narratives, understanding these narratives, is going to be really critical. And it's also worth mentioning that the IEA brought together a group of high-level commissioners for a global commission for urgent action on energy efficiency to try to understand what are the barriers and what can be done to really accelerate energy efficiency, given that improvement in energy efficiency has been very slow and has been reducing over the last few years. Therefore, what can be done to just really accelerate this? And the importance of narratives is something that is one of their findings as something that for energy efficiency is going to be particularly important. So I thought that was a good tie-in. And I think with that in mind, the narratives are both between government and society, but also within government and within the different levels and ministries of government. That's really important. And I just wanted to mention also the opportunity now for training. You know, we're seeing these the benefits of these different types of measures in a different way now, and there's a really good opportunity to do training within government and also within the industry to be able to identify the things that will be most effective in different places, and also it's a good time to plan, and that's why I think it's another point that's been brought up, the visibility of the fact that it's a long-term project, needs planning, needs consultation. Definitely, I mean, the question was how can industry and government work together? One of the things that we want to make sure is that they do, because that's absolutely critical. Therefore, roadmaps, the global ABC regional roadmaps that we've been doing, talking to many stakeholders, about 700 in total, to understand, to bring together industry, government, and other parts of the supply chain and stakeholders together is really critical to build this visibility and make the most out of what can be done now.
Thanks, Maxine, and thank you for having hinted at these roadmaps. When I started, I said it's a process as well. It's a framework and it's a process, and it is really because this co-creation is so important. So it's not, I mean, how do you set the right sort of standard? By being really informed about what is out there in terms of the new technologies. So to make it something that's interesting, that's stretching still things a little bit, but something that's achievable as well. So I think it has to go hand in hand and go up that way. And co-creation is the only real way to do that, and particularly bringing together the players along the entire value chain, because everybody has a role to play, as we said. So the more people understand each other, and it takes time doing that, the more people understand each other, the better the measures will actually fit with each other going forward. We've made a lot of good experience with co-creation in different sectors, and there's certainly no reason why it shouldn't be in this one. The Green Building Councils at the national level are a really good way of bringing together the communities. What we offer with the national alliances at the moment that are being created also under the Global ABC, this is a way of combining that with the governments, so a good way forward. I've seen Terry has, I'm sure you have some views on this, but you also have some news hot from the press in a sense about the international finance consultations.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to offer a concrete expression of co-creation. So it's not often on a webinar we can do a world premiere, but Canada's 5-year commitment that it made in 2015 to the Paris Agreement to support developing countries comes to an end this year, and we are now consulting domestically and internationally on how Canada should best support developing countries in their mitigation and adaptation objectives moving forward. That has literally just been launched, and the organizers have shared the link with all of the participants. So I would just like to invite everyone to take the wisdom of your questions and your insights if you wish, and feel free to share them with Canada so that we can capture this advice, which I think we would all agree applies absolutely to the construction sector, but also applies across a variety of different economic activities in very similar ways. Obviously, everything is specific, but we'd be very happy to hear from you, and I'll leave it there.
Excellent, wonderful. And I think the link will be shared with everybody, or is already shared with the entire audience. So
it's already shared.
It's very nice. Okay, excellent. We did have a few questions that are interesting but didn't quite fit within the flow. But we have, I'd say, 5 minutes that we could take them up, maybe very briefly. There was one, are there studies on the correlation of green buildings or individual and social well-being? I'd say yes, but is there anybody who wants to offer something concrete?
Well, I could just add on to that. I mean, we have for long understood that there may be a connection between the well-being of the ones being in the buildings and green buildings. And I think there is an excellent, actually, certification scheme now for that, which is actually called the WELL. Building upon to actually have the proof points of the ones that are in the building, having a better well-being and productivity levels as well, important for corporations if you have an office, actually connecting that to green. We can see that makes actually quite a driving force for corporate clients when they want to do an office space, to actually make it a high-level green, as well as adding on the WELL certification to make sure that their employees are going to do great within the building. And for Skanska, we have set forth now a target for all of our buildings within Central Europe to actually reach this kind of certification. And so those, yet again, if you get actually the directives, but also pin down the numbers, the performance that matters, the impact, then it's much more easy to make it also a part of the market and actually conceptualize as well as commercialize. And that's when you get the wheels going.
Okay, excellent. And there's a few numbers out there in terms of performance improvement, so it's proven, and also in terms of health and well-being that came out of checks with hospitals, for example. So I mean that's one that's of the individual buildings I've seen, but there's concrete numbers behind it.
Yes, and we should also mention there are other certifications, and I mean the Living Building Standard in the US is also taking into account well-being and health. BREEAM, there are several that are looking into this now, and it's a great move in the right direction.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, Martina, that we're finding again increasingly that it doesn't have to be at the compromise of one of the other performance aspects either. You can still achieve a net zero building that meets high standards and performance in terms of health and well-being as well. Particularly things like the sort of association with higher air change rates and therefore more energy consumption. But actually, there's ways to achieve both of those outputs without needing to compromise on the other. I think one other important stat for you is I think it's something like on average, if you work near a window or you have a space that has access to natural daylight, you may on average have 46 minutes more sleep per night, and I think we all like sleep, so another good benefit.
Nice, thank you. I'm watching the time as well, and we're getting close to the end. I wanted to give Marcin another opportunity to comment on any point that she'd like to highlight from the discussion, and the same then as well for Carrie and Maxine.
Great. So I'd just like to say I just love the word co-creation when you're talking about working with businesses and the government. I love that idea. Again, the construction industry, real estate development is probably one of the industries, the most industry, unlike renewable energy or unlike energy, that is solidly in the hands of the private sector. That's where most of the business is being done. So we need to recognize that. And that's why I keep harping on the business and sense, because that is the language of business. That is what is really going to appeal to them. And one of the problems we have with co-creation is that we tend to speak different languages, right? Government doesn't necessarily speak the language of dollars and cents, while business does. So we need to find common language that we speak. And I think Maxine made the point that, we haven't moved the needle on energy efficiency or green buildings the way we want. And we know that we're in this 10-year window where we absolutely need to bend the curve. We're at a point of urgency. We don't have any other time. So we need to really engage with the business community in construction. And also, the business community, particularly at the local level, has a huge impact on government in real estate. Huge in terms of lobbying, in terms of regulations. They have a huge impact. So we need to bring them along. We cannot do that without them. And so I just want us to make sure that as we're looking at this co-creation, we understand those pressures and we understand how to speak the language that will attract and move to action the business community, which we need, as well as the governments.
Excellent. Thank you, Marcin. Very.
Yeah, and I would just build on that last point from Marcin. I think it's really important as governments try to balance all of the pressures, all of the political dynamics. I mean, let's face it, this is a very difficult time in terms of COVID fiscal stimulus, and it's a very difficult time in terms of climate action. It's a politicized issue in many, many countries. This is where the business community can come in and can express their support and their interest, and that can be a game changer. So while governments have an absolute role to play in putting into place these incentives, in supporting these changes, in integrating this into fiscal stimulus packages, likewise, the business community that has a real interest in terms of its long-term sustainability and viability and its benefits that it's offering to its countries and the world community, it has an interest in reinforcing that and holding governments to account on that side. And so that's another element of co-creation that I would really encourage.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. We have literally 2 minutes left. I think we've come to the end of a closing. I'm sorry. If you have one last word, but a word or a very short sentence for Victoria and Leena, if you like, but very briefly.
I think Marcin put it so well. We have to speak the same language as business, and then we can actually do something quite scalable.
And I would add the word resilience.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Wonderful panel, I have to say, and you've made my life very easy in terms of summarizing things, because you all put up snippets. I think this is fantastic, so thank you very much. Thank you as well to the team in GGKP for having organized and having brought us together. I think it was an exciting discussion. It has been recorded, so please share it. There have been a few questions, very specific. We'll make sure that they are channeled to our panelists, and there can be a feedback loop that way. And I think as a concluding point, absolutely, there is a need for these stimulus packages to help with the transformation in the sector. There's a huge opportunity. It's not either or, it's both new build and the existing buildings. There's opportunities in both. There's a huge opportunity looking at the materials, the entire life cycle of things. With the job opportunities, obviously recognizing that we'll need to reskill and retool a few things here and there, and then obviously this nice closing in terms of co-creation, having all the partners coming together and moving together in terms of collective impact in the same direction. And that's not only for environment, that's for health and for the economy. So thank you so much. And with that, we're really at the end and closing on time. Thank you. Good seeing you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Martina. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.